Hi there, Mr. James. Where's Boris Johnson taken to this country?
Excuse me?
I said, where is Boris Johnson leading this country to at the moment?
Well, I think Boris Johnson's leading the country down the drain, actually,
Okay.
in terms of the way that he's behaved. Dominic Cummings has behaved. The Tory party want to leave Europe without a deal,
Yeah,
and the way they behaved in terms of negotiating,
yeah,
and people have gone on about being Ramonas, who
yeah,
are actually history deniers.
yeah.
Because if you knew, if you can go around saying to people that you're going to get your independence, your borders, and your sovereignty,
Yeah,
you can only get that when you're in power.
yeah,
So what you're doing is you're swapping Europe for Boris Johnson and Dominic Cummings' dictatorship, and that is extremely dangerous.
okay.
And anybody who tells you that they can get their independence and their borders and their sovereignty when they're not in power has no chance of doing that. They've got as much chance of getting their independence and their borders and their sovereignty as you would if you was in the parish workhouse. You try telling the master of the workhouse or the owner
Yeah.
of the workhouse, it was called the parochial beagle. If
Okay.
you try asking them whether you could have your independence, your borders and sovereignty in those days, they would tell you to get back on your treadmill. And by the way, the treadmill had a big metal bar, a massive wheel, and you had to keep pushing that. You got half an hour off, and then you had to do that. And you could do that until you died. They used to split families up. To be fair, the problem with this country is when you look back on the way that people were treated across the decades, the poor have been treated appallingly by the people at the top. But what happens to the poor now, as opposed to the poor who stood up for themselves in the time of, say, Richard I, when there was the poll tax, and we had the rich wanted to pay the same as the poor in terms of properties, and that was rejected by the peasants. There was a peasants' revolt, and they stood up to the establishment of the aristocracy, and they won that. Although it was obviously brutally done. Whereas that's all been undone now by Margaret Thatcher when she undone the. That was all undone now when she forced the poll tax through, and of course working class people couldn't do anything about that. The same way that when Rupert Murdoch moved his machines to Wapping and was negotiating with the print workers, when the print workers, he didn't tell them was that the machines could actually do the printing. So he knew they could print, but he still had this ongoing thing with the print workers. When they refused his offer, he sacked the whole lot. And again, working class people stood by and did nothing. You see, and then Tony Blair, when he came into power, Tony Blair promised working class people a referendum on Europe. And what happened was that he denied them a vote on Europe, but he tried to make himself head of the very organisation he denied them a vote on. In other words, he tried to make himself he wanted to be head of Europe, and he tried desperately to get there. It didn't work because the Europeans stopped him from doing that. It wasn't working class people or English people in this country who did that. It was the Europeans who did that. So we don't have as working class people, we don't have a very good track record of understanding how the history of a country and how a country is run. What we need to understand is that you can only get, the only time you can get your independence, your and sovereignty
Yeah.
is when you're in power. And what Boris Johnson did was he created a Brexit wall. We had the Berlin Wall, thank goodness that was gone. We had the Mexican War, which is still in dispute over there in America. And what Boris Johnson did was create a Brexit wall, so that the underfunding of the NHS, the underfunding of education system, kids going to school starving and not being able to have any food, and people having to go to food banks. All these issues were hidden behind the Brexit wall. And I said to people at the time, and I've got many people who can, as you yourself, who, as my cameraman, and also the person who asked me the question, will know, I told him before COVID or anything happened about a year ago, I said to him that because Johnson is building a Brexit wall, he's hiding the problems that this country has behind the wall. And I said to anybody who would listen, I'm terrified that something's going to come through that wall and we're not going to be ready for it. And sadly, something did come through. It was COVID. But at the end of the day, the one thing I would ask working class people in this country to do, to understand their history, to understand the history of where you are where you come from, and have you really gone that far? And you can have, say, football fans. You know, football fans who look at the back of a newspaper. They look at the football teams. They're quite happy whether it's won or lost. They look at the back, but then they go to the front of that newspaper, and then they're brainwashed by the right-wing ideology, which is on the front page of the newspaper, because the Sun is a Tory newspaper, which most people know, and you've got the Daily Mail, which was obviously owned by Lord Rothermere. So we've got all of these issues that are poisoning the system. And what we need now is to take a step back. We know that COVID, we know that Brexit cost us something like £150 billion, and that's what it's been in the media. And on top of that, it was supposed to be £77 billion, but that may have changed since COVID come along. Somebody on the Financial Times said a few weeks ago that COVID had already cost us £360 billion. I've got no way of knowing whether that's true, but that's what was said. So this is all money that's going out of the country, so going out of the system, sorry. So we're spending more money than's coming in, and I don't know what's coming next. So all I can say to you is, for goodness sake, understand the history of a country, know where you are and what the situation you're in, and do not fall foul of propaganda.
Okay, my next question is about all these English people like voted for Boris Johnson and now they're realising.
Well, I think the reason that the polls are showing 40, showing 40-40, in other words, the Tory party and the Labour Party are neck and neck, is because the things that were hidden behind the Brexit wall are now coming through. The things that I've been talking about for the last 2 years are now coming through that wall. And what you should never allow in this country, never allow anybody to build a wall which people can hide things behind. Because as Len McCluskey said yesterday, he made a very good point about the reason the Labour Party lost the election was on one issue, Brexit, but because the other party was not willing to talk about any of the other issues, and now these issues are at the forefront. We have an NHS, which we've got a social care, that we're 100,000 people short in social care. I don't know whether that's because of the way that people behaved in an election by either Farage telling people to go home, or the feeling that immigrants didn't feel comfortable anymore to stay here, and then the draconian measures brought about by the Foreign Secretary, which makes it very difficult for anybody to come in unless they've got I think it was something like £25,000, and that's good. I mean, to me, anybody who can come into this country as an immigrant and who can earn £25,000 or more, that sounds like social engineering, because you're more likely to be able to, if you've got that type of money, you're more likely to vote Tory.
My next question. So how do you feel about the UK heading what's the future saying about it after COVID? So many people been dying, over like 50,000 people.
Yeah, and I did see today, it's another chance of another, I think it was 47,000, I think it was, that Professor Whitty was saying could be during the winter if people don't, I think he said it, I think it's called, if people don't self-isolate, or if people don't self-distance themselves. And obviously they're saying it can only be 60 or less. And so unless people do exactly what the government's doing, or what they were doing when people were behaving, like wearing masks and distancing, and not going to see, and young people taking it seriously, and not believing people who say that COVID doesn't exist. We know it exists. We know it's there. We know it's going to kill people. Young people have to be very careful that even though it may not affect them, it will affect the older generation. And I think also looking at the social care, we need to make sure that old people are looked after properly. And the testing situation for social care also is that it's not that you just test an old person while they're there in hospital and then you release them. You could test somebody a day or so before and they're fine, but once they end up in their home, in the old people's home, they could end up with COVID. They might have COVID, which they could then pass on to other people. So you must do two tests: one in the hospital and one in the actual old people's home at all, as well. But at the end of the day, the one thing is, one, we have to get COVID under control, as the Professor Richard Patrick Vallance has said, and two, we have to rethink, with all the money we've spent, whether we really now can afford to leave Europe. And I'm not saying that it's not to overrule anybody on referendums or anything like that. It's to take a step back and think about all the money we've spent, and for you who's listening to this, to look at China, to look at America, and to wonder whether or not you really can trust these countries to deliver, and whether our relationship in Europe will be damaged by coming out of Europe without a deal, and more importantly than that, breaking international law. Thank you for listening.
Okay, thank you. Bye.